Everyone thinks they know Steve Jobs, the perfectionist genius who invented the iPhone, the visionary who could see the future before anyone else, the man who was simply decades ahead of his time. But what if everything you think you know about Steve Jobs being ahead of his time is completely wrong? What if the real story behind his genius is far more controversial, far more calculated, and far more unsettling than the image we have of him? Because when you dig into the actual evidence, when you look past the carefully crafted legend, you discover that Steve Jobs wasn't ahead of his time at all. He was something much more dangerous. Let's start with the biggest lie. Steve Jobs was not a perfectionist. This isn't some minor detail. This misconception has fundamentally warped how we understand his success and why it took him so long to achieve it. The original Macintosh took over 3 years to develop. 3 years. Not because the technology was impossible, but because Jobs was obsessing over details that had nothing to do with what users actually wanted. He demanded the internal circuit boards look beautiful, even though no user would ever see them. He redesigned the case repeatedly, adding months to development time. This wasn't perfectionism, it was something much more destructive. Real perfectionism would have meant creating the perfect user experience, not the perfect invisible details. Jobs was trapped by his own psychological need for control, and it almost destroyed Apple before it began. But here's where it gets interesting. When Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, something had changed. The second generation Steve Jobs deliberately abandoned perfectionism. The iPhone, his most celebrated creation, was objectively flawed. The battery life was terrible compared to competitors. Typing was difficult without a physical keyboard. Call quality was mediocre at best. A true perfectionist would have delayed the iPhone until these problems were solved. Instead, Jobs made a calculated decision to sacrifice critical features that power users demanded in order to optimize for what mass markets actually wanted: a larger screen for web browsing and media consumption. This wasn't genius foresight. This was cold, calculated market analysis disguised as innovation. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Steve Jobs barely invented anything. Steve Wozniak, Apple's co-founder, and the actual technical genius behind their early success, was brutally honest about this. Steve didn't ever code. He wasn't an engineer, and he didn't do any original design. The graphical user interface? Xerox invented it years earlier. Jobs saw it at their research center in 1979 and essentially stole the concept. The mouse? Also Xerox. Multi-touch screens? They existed before the iPhone. Even the App Store concept had predecessors. But this is where the story gets truly fascinating, because Jobs wasn't stealing randomly. He was doing something far more sophisticated and ethically questionable. Steve Jobs had discovered something that would make him billions and reshape entire industries. But it wasn't time travel, and it wasn't supernatural foresight. It was a strategy so effective that it's been carefully hidden from the public narrative about his genius. Jobs realized that most groundbreaking technologies follow a predictable pattern. They're invented in research labs years or even decades before they become commercially viable. The real opportunity isn't in inventing. It's in perfecting the timing of mass market introduction. When Jobs visited Xerox PARC in 1979, he wasn't looking at cutting-edge research. He was looking at technologies that were already 10 years old but had never been successfully commercialized. The GUI had been sitting in research labs since the late 1960s. Xerox had the technology but couldn't figure out how to make it profitable or user-friendly. This is the controversial reality of how Jobs operated. He identified technologies that were mature enough to be reliable, but had failed commercially due to poor execution, high costs, or limited market understanding. Then, he waited for the perfect moment to reintroduce them. The iPod wasn't revolutionary because it was the first MP3 player. It wasn't. Digital audio players had existed for years, but they were clunky, expensive, and had limited storage. Jobs waited until hard drive technology, battery technology, and manufacturing costs had evolved to the point where he could create a seamless experience at a reasonable price point. But here's what makes this strategy ethically complex. Jobs actively encouraged the myth that he was inventing these technologies from scratch. He rarely credited the original inventors or the researchers whose work made his products possible. Instead, he cultivated an image as a lone genius, creating magical products from pure imagination. This wasn't just marketing, it was systematic historical revisionism. Jobs understood that consumers wanted to believe in individual genius rather than collaborative technological evolution, so he gave them that story, even though it was fundamentally false. Jobs' famous reality distortion field wasn't wasn't charismatic leadership. It was sophisticated psychological manipulation. He would convince his engineers that impossible deadlines were achievable, not through inspiration, but through a calculated exploitation of their desire for approval and fear of confrontation. Former Apple employees describe a culture where Jobs would alternate between extreme praise and brutal criticism, creating an environment where employees became psychologically dependent on his validation. This wasn't motivational leadership. It was textbook psychological conditioning. But it worked. Engineers would work impossible hours, sacrifice their personal lives, and push beyond their technical limitations not because they believed in the vision, but because they had been conditioned to seek Jobs' approval and fear his disapproval. So if Jobs wasn't a perfectionist, wasn't an inventor, and wasn't actually ahead of his time, what was he? He was history's most sophisticated technology synthesizer. His genius wasn't in seeing the future. It was in recognizing when existing technologies had matured enough to be combined into something that felt magical to consumers who had never seen the individual components before. Take the iPhone. The multi-touch screen existed. Mobile internet existed. Powerful mobile processors existed. GPS existed. Digital cameras existed. But no one had successfully integrated all these mature technologies into a single device with an interface simple enough for mass adoption. Jobs didn't invent the future. He assembled it from parts that already existed, then convinced the world he had created magic. The most controversial aspect of the Jobs legend is how calculated his timing actually was. Every major Apple product launch was timed not to technological breakthroughs, but to market readiness and competitive vulnerability. The original iPhone wasn't launched because touchscreen technology had suddenly improved. It was launched because BlackBerry had become complacent, Microsoft's mobile efforts were fragmented, and consumer behavior was shifting toward mobile internet usage. Jobs had teams constantly monitoring technological maturity, manufacturing costs, competitor weaknesses, and consumer behavior patterns. When multiple factors aligned, he would launch products that seemed revolutionary, but were actually just perfectly timed assemblies of existing technologies. This strategic patience is why Apple rarely launches truly first-generation products. Instead, they wait for others to experiment with new categories, learn from their failures, then enter the market with polished versions that appear to be innovations but are actually just superior executions. So was Steve Jobs ahead of his time? Not in the way we've been told. He wasn't a time traveler with supernatural foresight. He was something potentially more impressive and definitely more disturbing. A master strategist who understood technology adoption patterns better than anyone in history. He recognized that breakthrough technologies follow predictable cycles from research to commercialization, and he positioned himself to capitalize on these cycles at exactly the right moments. He understood that consumers don't want the most advanced technology. They want technology that feels advanced but is actually intuitive and reliable. Most controversially, he realized that the mythology of individual genius sells better than the reality of collaborative technological evolution. So he carefully constructed a personal brand that obscured the true sources of his product's innovations. The real Steve Jobs wasn't ahead of his time. He was exactly on time, every time, with a precision that was almost algorithmic in its accuracy. That's not magic. That's not genius in the way we typically understand it. That's something much more calculated and much more powerful. And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable truth of all. The future isn't created by individual visionaries seeing what others can't see. It's created by strategic synthesizers who understand systems, timing, and human psychology better than the rest of us can imagine. Steve Jobs wasn't ahead of his time. He was ahead of our understanding of how technology adoption actually works. And that might be an even more remarkable achievement than the myth we've been telling ourselves. The question is, are you ready to accept that the future isn't magic? It's just really, really good strategy?